Hi, everyone. This is Patrick Donahoe, and thanks for watching or listening to this episode of the World Standard Podcast. I'm really excited to talk with my guest today, whose name is Greg Lukianoff. And before I let him introduce himself, I'm going to give a short bio. So Greg Lukianoff is an attorney, New York Times best-selling author, and the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. He's the author of a number of books, including Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate, Freedom from Speech, and FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus. And FIRE is the acronym for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And then most recently, which is the book we'll probably get most into today, is The Coddling of the American Mind. I love that word, coddling. How good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And the co-author of that book was Jonathan Haidt. So, Greg, I'm super excited to have you on. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.
So I just want to dive right into it. So would you maybe give us just a brief, tell us about your background and the path that took you to the organization you now lead, FIRE, and the books you've authored, including the most recent one.
Sure, absolutely. It's a little bit of a long story, but I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. So let's go back to how I was born. My father,
there's Joe Rogan has done 4-hour podcasts before, so.
Oh, that's great. Well, my father is a Russian refugee who grew up in Yugoslavia. My mother is ethnically Irish, grew up in Britain, and thinks of herself as British. And growing up, my parents had very different ideas of the comparative value of truthfulness versus politeness, with my mom having an exaggerated sense of politeness coming from being sort of like an Irish girl in Britain. So sometimes you get like you want to be more British than the British, and my dad, has a sort of Russian sense that if it's not, that you want to be fairly cutting, and that essentially, as my father would say, politeness is a form of deception, which it is, to be fair. And so, I joked that my earliest memory was Christmas when I was 4 years old, and it's true. And I got a toy that I didn't like, and my mom. And it was the first time I remember getting a toy I didn't like. My mom wanted me to be polite, and my dad wanted me to be honest. My mom wanted me to be polite, my dad wanted me to be honest. And so I do what any good 4-year-old would do, is I break out in tears. And my oldest sister, Katie, was like, "Oh, poor baby, got a toy he didn't like," starts crying. And I remember being like, "I don't have the words for this, but the problem really here is a societal paradox." Because I didn't know how to explain it, but it was just kind of like, no, I was put in a situation where I couldn't say what I wanted to say because it was considered wrong, but I had to be honest. I couldn't do both. So partially, my whole appreciation for freedom of speech comes in part from being an immigrant kid and living in a neighborhood with a lot of other first-generation kids or other kids from different parts of the country. And that meant that really, more or less, you had to kind of develop your own rules. And the first one is you had to hear people out. And you couldn't impose anybody else's idea of politeness because nobody's parents agreed on what politeness meant. So that's, it's really essential to kind of like how I got really excited about this. I went to undergrad at American University, where I was a student journalist. That gets you really radicalized with regards to freedom of speech. Always people coming into your office saying, "Can you fire so-and-so?" It's like, no, I can't fire so-and-so. And what's your reason? And watching the wheels turn in people's heads to be kind of like, I don't know why I should censor you or how I could get away with it, but give me some time. And realizing just how felicitous we were at this whole process. So I went to law school, specialized in First Amendment. I went to Stanford for law school. I took every class that they had on First Amendment. And then when I ran out of that, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty, because that's how you know something's your passion is if you tell people about it. They're like, that sounds ridiculous. I interned at the ACLU of Northern California, and despite all of this experience, when I started at FIRE, when it was only about a year and a half old, way back in 2001, I was shocked at how easy it was to get in trouble on the modern college campus.
Wow.
But what was different back then, and this is the bulk of my career, is that the students were actually the best constituency on campus for freedom of speech. they got it. They got, they love their Dave Chappelle. They got offensive comedians. They got like even like the hard, bonus credit questions, when it comes to First Amendment stuff, in a way that some professors did, but not all, and in a way that a lot of administrators just didn't. And so I sometimes explain my career as being a chunk of pretty much 2001 to 2013 being when I was almost exclusively dealing with administrators silencing people. It looks like you had a question.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see how how influences kind of shape your view of the world and personality and what you think and what you come to believe. So maybe I would assume in law school specifically, like how did you get to the point where you understood individual rights and maybe the connection it had to education to the level where you pursued making this your career, especially with fire?
I'm not sure if I understood it as being anything more than just something essential for a genuinely free society, and that so many things that it's kind of funny because sometimes people who are not first generation or not immigrants, including my wife, could kind of pick on us for the fact that my mother, we call each other on the 4th of July. We wish each other a happy 4th of July. And they, my wife kind of thought that was kind of cute and sort of silly. And I'm like, okay, this is one thing that like immigrant kids get that other people don't. There's a lot to like about this country, and there are a lot of things that we should never take for granted. And right at the top of the list is free speech. It's unusual in human history. It's unusual in the world in general. And it is probably one of the great innovations in all of human history, but it's also extraordinarily fragile. So I went in there like a real believer in it anyway. But the education part, honestly, like I didn't give the education element that much thought until I was recruited by Fire back in 2001. But when I thought about it, I was like, well, right, yeah, I have run into some of this stuff in college. It was never that terrible, but certainly
interesting. All right.
Seeing columnists get in trouble when I was an undergrad was definitely pretty common. And definitely Stanford was an environment where even at that time, it was really easy to say the wrong thing because people were kind of almost like pulling for you to say the wrong thing. And that was, my living in San Francisco, that was kind of like my first experience with like really runaway groupthink, where I lived in DC for 6 years and I missed the way we argued in DC when I was living out there. But it was only when I started at Fire when I started to realize how bad it was. It didn't take me very long before I started having cases where they're consistently cases where you're saying to yourself, you gotta be kidding me. The case that we give in the book, and I've given over and over again, but it's probably one of Fire's most famous cases, is we had a student get in trouble for reading a book in public. The book was called Notre Dame versus the Klan. He was trying to educate himself on Klan history. And what people sometimes these days don't know is that they were also anti-Catholic back then. And they marched on Notre Dame back in, I think, 26 or maybe 24. And there was a great street battle. Students went out and fought them, and they won. So it's just like joyously anti-Klan book. So not that makes it any more or less protected. It just makes it more ironic that he got in trouble. And so he was found guilty of a racial harassment at the school, public school in Indiana, because it made 2 employees allegedly uncomfortable. The title of the book and the picture of the rally on the cover. And that was kind of, for a long time, that was, nobody was really paying attention to these kind of cases. And so I spent a lot of my career, banging on this drum saying, it's actually much worse than you think. And that was my first book on learning liberty, was more or less saying, guys, this is actually worse than you think. That being said, in 2012, it actually seemed like things were on a positive trajectory. That essentially things were getting better. The cases weren't quite as ridiculous, which was just one way to tell how good or bad your speech environment is. But somehow, 2013, right around 2013, 2014, right after my book came out, we started seeing seemingly overnight this sudden push among the students to demand that speakers be disinvited, not just, I don't want to hear this person and I'm going to protest outside their speech, but I don't want them setting foot on my campus. That's when you start hearing about things like trigger warning requests and microaggression policies. That's when you start seeing, the students really, taking to the streets themselves, to be, in some cases, unfortunately, mob censors shouting people down, for example. And this was, this was not what I was used to. And it really seemingly happened very quickly. So I wrote a short book, and I think it's, one of the better things I've written in 2014, when this was all brand new to me, called Freedom from Speech. It's only about 9,000 words, but it's me more or less just explaining how I actually think that freedom of speech is endangered by progress itself. And what I mean by that, as your society, as you as a society, as you as an individual, get to be more comfortable, get to have more technology, get to have more options in who you talk to, both online and off, and live in communities that better reflect your values. You can physically move to areas that are more like-minded people. That this is going to necessarily have a negative effect on freedom of speech. Because people who are in these echo chambers, people who are in these environments that sound so wonderfully pleasant to be like, I'm going to live in communities that reflect my values. I'm going to join internet communities that also reinforce my values. But there's a real problem with that. The social science is very clear that when you just talk to people with whom you agree politically, for example, you tend to become much more radicalized in the position of the group, if only out of weight of arguments that you know for your side and not for the other. So I made the argument in Freedom from Speech that this is going to actually get worse, and it's actually going to be kind of a condition of wealth, of progress.
Of progress, yeah.
Yeah. So that was Freedom from Speech. But then in 2015, I had the pleasure of writing with my then very new friend, Jonathan Haidt, a famous, brilliant social psychologist who wrote a wonderful book, well, actually two wonderful books. The Happiness Hypothesis, which is about taking a scientific approach to what actually makes people happy and trying to figure out which does. So like, short observations are like, don't live by the airport, try to limit your commute, those are very robust findings. But then two things that came out very strongly were meditation and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's why I wanted to talk to John back in 2015 about this idea I've been thinking. And it comes from, I'm very open about this in the book. It comes from getting very depressed back in 2007. And I'd always had issues with depression in my life, but this was, going to the hospital kind of bad, which was the first time I ever really had to go to the hospital. What got me out of that, which actually forever changed my relationship to my own depression, was, and I always want to be clear, I also took medications, and I was recently criticized by someone saying, it's like, but you don't talk about medication. I'm like, absolutely, talk to your psychiatrist, get help, talk to your doctor right away. But CBT for the long term was really the thing that helped me. And what CBT is more or less learning some of the crazy exaggerations everybody's brain makes, kind of like when you go on a date and it doesn't go well and you're like, I'm going to die alone. That's a cognitive distortion, because you're not, from this, you don't know you're going to die alone. This is just a crazy kind of exaggeration that most people make. And these include things like binary thinking. Everything's going to be all good or all bad. Fortune telling, this idea that, I'm going to die alone. Catastrophizing, if I get a C on this paper, I'll never get into Princeton or whatever. And these are all ideas that you have to kind of learn to talk back to. And amazingly, and it takes practice, it takes a lot of practice. But if you get yourself in the habit of talking back to the sort of sad and crazy and depressed voices in your head, they start having a lot less power over you. And it's the reason why I still get depressed sometimes, but I now can fight back in a way that I never could before. Look like I had a question.
No, I was going to say, it's interesting because, you're talking about kind of the spectrum of emotions or spectrum of feelings. And, it's interesting. And I think this is what you're alluding to, but experiencing that is, I would say, instrumental to growth and learning, right? Yeah. And you talk a lot about in the book, safetyism and protectionism, right? And those type of experiences when, there's so much pressure there that you really need to figure things out. It teaches you so much. But at the same time, as you've been speaking, right, I think it's one of those natural tendencies that we have to want to be safe. I mean, it's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like you want safety. And people find safety in a lot of different things, but when there's a group of people that believe the way that they believe, and think the way that they think and say the thing that they, they may not even, they may come with thoughts and will align with people with the same thoughts, but then when it's there, right, it becomes so strong because the numbers, the collective is magnified, where something that's different, it's difficult to cope with that. At the same time, are you making the point that, those difficulties, right, the experience of other point of views or things that are disruptive are in fact healthy and beneficial?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. And this is, my thinking on education overall is a lot of education, frankly, is learning to overcome some of our, worser nature, to Shakespeare it up. And some of it is, our desire for comfort, our desire for affirmation, can actually come with some really serious negative side effects. And even my horrible, horrifying depression. After the fact, I realized that I was really anxious about taking the job as president. I was formerly the legal director of fire, and I loved that job. It was like a lawyer's dream come true to be that. And I was very anxious about becoming president, partially because I didn't know if I could take it. I mean, like you're in the culture war all the time. It's really nasty, and I was afraid I might like have a breakdown. And then in 2007, I had one, and then I got over it. And I felt like that fear of like what I was capable of had put sort of a cap on the possibilities for my entire life. And that was lifted, and I paid a horrible price for it. It was really, really difficult. But at the end, it's hard for me not to see that as something that I had to eventually work through or spend the rest of my life always a little bit afraid of my own fragility.
So do you associate that right there, that the as the driving force behind why there are issues on college campuses, why you have, helicopter parents, is
Yep.
just, maybe irrational sense of fear?
Yeah, absolutely. An exaggerated sense of fear, which is sometimes semi-rational at least. But
Yeah.
yeah, actually explain a little bit more about how the thought process happened. So I'm working on college campuses, trying to overcome my own depression and anxiety by teaching myself don't overgeneralize, don't catastrophize, don't personalize, don't do all of these things that we talk about in the book, and we have like a list of cognitive distortions in the book that are super helpful. And I was looking at what was going on campus, being like, it seems like administrators are constantly actually telling students, by the way, you should catastrophize, you should personalize, you should do all these things. I'm like, wow, this is going to make people depressed and anxious. But at the time, I was saying to myself also, thank goodness students aren't buying it, that they're not listening to it. It's not, so far, it doesn't seem to be having much effect on them. And then in 2013, 2014, it just got a lot worse. And one of the things that it's not unheard of for students to come out against freedom of speech.
Mhm.
This happened in the late 80s, early 90s as well. That was kind of like the first great age of political correctness. That's, where most of us remember that term from. But at the time, they were mostly talking about things like bigotry and racism and all this kind of stuff. Whereas that was certainly still part of the argument in 2013, 2014. But the emphasis was very much on sort of psychology, that essentially this person, if they come onto campus, it's not just that I'll hate the fact that they're there, but me, or more importantly, my fellow students will find it psychologically harmful in a real medical sense for that person to be on campus. And I knew enough about, I'm kind of a psychology hobbyist to be like, that doesn't sound right. Like that doesn't sound, I should definitely go get a sanity check from my friend John Haidt about this. And I told him, about this idea about how it seems like we're teaching cognitive distortions. And to my delight, he said, let's write an article about it. And I was like, sure, of course we'll write an article. Like in a heartbeat, I'd love to write an article with you. So this was back in 2014, right around the time that I was publishing Freedom from Speech. And we published an article in the Atlantic called Coddling of the American Mind. By the way, a title I actually didn't really love because I thought it sounded kind of insulting to students that I was trying to reach. But, to give you a sense of how it was probably the right title to go with, my preferred title was Arguing Towards Misery, which everybody who hears it's like, that is really, really boring.
Yeah.
So we wrote this article.
Coddling's a good word. Coddling's a good, catchy word.
It's a nice old-fashioned word that everybody knows.
Yeah.
So we write this article in 2015, also called Coddling the American Mind, and we talk about microaggressions. We talk about trigger warnings and about how this seems to actually be teaching students not to get over their fears, not to confront ideas that make them uncomfortable, and giving them a whole sort of battery of things, which we said that's a formula for making people more depressed and more anxious than they already are. So we published the article, expecting to be beheaded because we were saying stuff that if you said on a campus would probably at least get you called to an office somewhere. But we said it in the Atlantic, and instead the response was shockingly positive. And that we had, and it was really meant a lot to me to have people, there was one person wrote an article saying her brother had killed himself several years ago, and she was in a classroom where nobody knew that, and they covered an incident. The story included someone jumping off of a building, which is exactly the way her brother committed suicide. Yeah, it's horrible. But she said that, but it was also the first time that anybody treated me not with kid gloves. That essentially, like, nobody actually stared at me, nobody actually said, censored it so that and it was the first time she felt normal in years, and that it really, and I know that feeling when you're just kind of like, please just don't treat me different for a second. I need to just feel normal. And that, some of those outpourings really meant a lot to me. And so John and I were like, oh, well, for a while there was the second most read cover story in the history of the Atlantic. And we were like, okay, wow.
Wow.
And we felt like we'd done our jobs, and as I jokingly say, and we cured the whole problem. Just kidding. We thought we were basically done with it. We thought we'd made our argument, and it would go back to our other work. And unfortunately, everything got much, much worse on campus. So we decided to write a book about it, to go really deeper, most importantly, into this question: what was so different about the class, the entering class in 2013, 2014? What made this really sort of like discontinuity so stark?
And what was that? That was one of my questions. What was that epicenter? What was that, like, ground zero of why that caused?
Why it got so much worse. So the whole book really is dedicated to trying to figure that out. And the thing that really sort of made us certain that we had to do this research was because as we had already agreed to do the book, but we just really early on, we started getting the data. Because at the time when we wrote the article in 2015, there, unsurprisingly, wasn't a tremendous amount of data about what the class of 2014 looked like, because it wasn't ready yet. We start getting the data on the psychological profile of the incoming class of 2013, 2014, and the incoming class of 2015, 2016, and all the way up to 2016. And it was terrifying. You're talking about, self-reports of anxiety and depression tripling in some cases. And, sometimes people are like, oh, this just means they're more comfortable with it. Also, people being seen for anxiety and depression going way, way up. And if people say, oh, well, that just means that we're spotting it more often. And we're like, okay, well, that's, two big pieces of data right there that you're kind of dismissing. The one that is undismissible, though, that's not something that can be changed by definition, is the saddest one: hospital admissions for self-harm and suicides.
That's good. Yep.
Yeah, and we're talking about, if you look at the trajectory for young women, from 2008 to 2017, 2018, so the suicide rate doubled. Overall, if you take the entire first decade of this century and compare them to the last couple of years, it's up around 70% for girls. The mental health crisis has been hitting boys less severely, and we have theories about that, about why that is in the book. But the whole book is dedicated to figuring out how this happened. We definitely, when we dug into it, we left with a strong belief that social media was making a lot of existing problems much, much worse. Social media kind of accelerated all sorts of things. I think it also accelerated polarization, which is another thread that we talk about as having been a contributing factor to making people feel like, there's either people who agree with me or evil people, more or less. But when it came to the anxiety and depression, the correlation was definitely there, that extensive social media use and depression and anxiety were pretty well correlated. Now, why this generation? Well, when you work backwards, figuring out what would have made this class different, they were probably the first class hitting school that were on social media with a phone in their pocket as much as they wanted to be. They really came of age at, unfortunately, the right time. And when people are sort of skeptical about, for example, why this hit girls harder, it's like, think of, if you have sisters, imagine the worst aspects of junior high school, but then imagine them 24 hours a day forever.
Yeah,
And most
I have two daughters in middle school right now, junior high.
oh, geez, well, if you can keep them off social media for a little while,
Yep.
it, as we dug more into it, there's even some research indicating that the lack of sleep from being on your phone all the time might be a contributing factor as well. That's one of the reasons why I say 24 hours, because that nasty, nasty environment, and of course, when people are in these social media bubbles, they're even worse about it because there's none of that sort of like face-to-face element. They've got sort of a cheering section more or less behind them. It's easier to the people who agree with you become much more salient in your social media life than they would, even if you're in a room being nasty to someone and there's one person who's kind of like, you're being jerks, like that's enough oftentimes to check that kind of behavior. But on social media, the dynamic can become much nastier. So we definitely think that when it comes to the genuine increase in mood disorders, we think that social media plays a big role. We think that made the polarization part of it worse. We also talk about new ideas about social justice becoming much more popular. We talk about intersectionality in the book. Intersectionality is a concept that we're very clear on. We think there's a lot of validity to it. That essentially, in order to understand someone's identity, you can't just take the broad category. The person who first proposed this was more or less saying there are issues faced by Black people and there are issues faced by women, but it's not quite right to think that the same issues would be faced by the combination just of Black and women. That essentially it could be an entirely different category of problem or at least a very different nature of a problem. And John and I both say we think she's entirely right. But the way intersectionality has been interpreted on campus is something that we call common enemy identity politics versus common humanity identity politics. We're very in favor of common humanity identity politics. This is like in the great speeches of MLK, he comes to this over and over again, where he's not saying that we're enemies. He's saying that you should understand us as your brothers and sisters, and that we deserve the same dignity and rights that all of you have enjoyed. And our founding fathers said, we the people enjoy this, and it's incredibly morally compelling. It's the approach that was eventually very successful in the gay rights movement and the women's rights movement as well. Just saying, like, calling us out on our double standards and saying, we deserve this too. And that's very compelling, and it broadens kind of like the definition of your society. It's very, there's something morally satisfying about it. But common enemy identity politics is more of what you'll see on social media these days, which is
all the vitriol, yeah.
Yeah, well, and when you see people talking about different intersections of privilege, to a large degree, they're engaging in that. And not to say that, and of course, people are like, so you're saying privilege doesn't exist? I'm like, no, I'm not saying privilege doesn't exist. But if your argument is, effectively, if you check off any of these boxes, I don't have to listen to you, and I have a quick rhetorical out of an argument with you, unfortunately, that's going to get abused to high heaven. So I sometimes think like people who really believe in intersectionality should be the most critical of people who just use it as a, arguing technique to get out of arguments that they don't like. And if you really follow the intersectionality, the privilege theory down the rabbit hole, you realize pretty quickly that given all the tools that have come out of it, you can dismiss the opinions of 100% of the entire population of the species. And that's a very tempting argument to use, thing to use rhetorically. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything to bring people together. It doesn't do anything to make people feel happier about themselves or anything else. Because another thing, when I try to explain what's sort of depressing about this ideology, is because as it's currently interpreted, it means that practically all of us, well, not us too, most people on campus are both oppressed and oppressor. White men are just merely oppressors, unfortunately. But almost everybody else, is some combination of the two, and it's treated as if it is just a fact of nature, and there's really nothing you can do to change it, and it's going to be this way forever.
But also, great, because this is what's going through my mind, because it's a fascinating topic, and it's, the relevance is, clearly there with college campuses, but
Mhm.
it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
all sorts of, it's throughout society. And I read the acronym of FIRE, which is the individual rights is a big, that's the meat in the middle. And I can't help but think that it's just the understanding of what the collective in a group is, and a society, and a class, versus an individual. And
Yeah.
it's the mesh of that, and like the misunderstanding, or just not the right view of what an individual is and what their rights are, and then what a group is and what their rights are.
Mhm.
That's where I think it sets I don't know. I've at least tried to talk to my kids and my girls, because they deal, they're dealing with it daily now. And I look at them wanting to fit in, them wanting to be part of a group, wanting to be part of.
Yeah.
They want to fit in. They want to be liked, and they find identity in that. However, there's so much weight there, as opposed to the actual individual they are, which is unique to them,
Mhm.
and celebrating that. And it's almost this kind of like pull between the two desires, the two driving forces, wanting to be part of a group, but also recognizing that you're an individual. And I think that's where social media has been amazing, but it's also been very destructive. And maybe the common theme is just the lack of understanding when it comes down to what an individual is, what their rights are, and what a group is and what their rights are. Are you following that? Does that have relevance to how you've written about these things, and potentially what some of the solutions are?
Yeah, well, interestingly, kind of like, one of the reasons why we have individual rights in our name is not just because freedom of speech and due process are individual rights, but because when Alan Kors and Harvey Silverglate were thinking about these issues going back to, the 1980s and 90s, was that there was kind of a sense that it was individual rights was kind of like a dirty word almost, because really more the idea is sort of like this group rights kind of idea, that essentially somehow having a better concept of group rights would somehow set us free or make us more progressive or something like that. But the thing I always try to explain is that individual rights protects group rights. That if you have the right to decide that what group you can join, it's entirely within your rights to decide that the primary way you evaluate yourself is by your membership in whatever particular group. But it has to be left up to the individual to also say, I prefer not to make the dominant part of my self-identification to be my race or my economic background or any of this kind of stuff. Someone is free to identify themselves more as a Mormon, for example, or for that matter, as an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with group rights is it takes that freedom away from individuals and treats them, it treats them like automatons, essentially, like, more or less, kind of like, here's your leader. Good luck with that. And it makes it very hard to be a dissenter. And so, like, if you look at the way we argue on campus, when someone who take a contrarian, kind of like Glenn Laurie at Brown University. He's a black professor who a lot of times will be like the one leading the charge against silly expressions of political correctness, and for that he gets treated in a lot of cases like some kind of traitor. Now he's old enough that he just doesn't really care anymore, which is one of the nice things about getting older. But it is interesting because it speaks to this idea that, and I call it, I haven't written about this yet, but I call this the perfect rhetorical fortress. That essentially, like, if you look at all of the one thing that colleges have really excelled at, from the 1980s on, unfortunately, is using a lot of IQ power to figure out a series of defenses that basically mean you never actually have to have an argument with somebody ever again, or at least never have to listen to someone that you really disagree with. And it was simple enough when I was in school if you could dub someone conservative, you didn't have to listen to them anymore. So that was even back in the 90s, and that's surely primitive and silly, but it was weird. It was I hate to say it was even effective on me in some cases, and I'm now ashamed of that. But as you go on, you start seeing, like I said, the privilege ideology really does allow you to dismiss at least 99% of the entire population of the planet, if not more. But then you add things like class and economic privilege, and some of the Connor Fieserdorf wrote about this. He calls them the idioms of non-argument, assuming bad motives. And congratulations, like, you have multiple defenses that allow you to just dismiss, without actually addressing the substance of their argument, every single person you ever meet that you disagree with. Now, the wonderful trick is, of course, you don't have to use that for anybody you agree with. So it could be like the whitest, richest person in the entire world, but you don't have to dismiss them, and you wouldn't probably want to if you actually 100% agreed with them. And this is a really strong reminder that when people, had all these rules about argumentation, about trying to address the substance of someone's argument, that's in the face of our really natural inclination to find some other dodge, some other way to get out of it. That doesn't mean I actually have to have this unpleasant experience of an argument.
But that's like the biggest opportunity for growth, right? And
Absolutely,
it's one of those I have a saying, because I've had hundreds of employees over the years, and I've had tons of hardships. I meltdowns, years ago, and I just, a lot of what we're talking about, I've thought through a lot and discovered certain things here and there. But we have a saying now, which has really become one of our values, which is, it doesn't matter who's right. It's understanding what's right, and the discovery of what's right oftentimes comes about, through facing the fear of being wrong. And there's such a tremendous fear there of, because the people relate being wrong from the perspective of somebody else somehow equates to something wrong with you, and it's not true. And that's where I look at, again, it's the opportunity to grow. And because of society, and that was a huge point that you made, which is society is changing daily. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's kind of like the groups are getting stronger and stronger and stronger, because the sense of uncertainty is strengthening. But at the same time, I think uncertainty is so beautiful because of how it lets a person, make tremendous progress, groups to make progress. But you have to face that fear of being wrong, because everybody has that. I mean, that's just the nature of life and humanity, is that, we have quirks and nuances and things we're not good at, but we have things we're great at. And that's where it's like the convergence of different personalities and strengths and individuals, allows for just incredible discovery. But I see why, it dates back to the wars that existed since the beginning of time, which is this group versus this group.
Yep.
And I look at really college and the education that's past the point where a child is at their parents' home and they have a sense of safety and stability there. I mean, this is an environment where bodies are changing, minds are changing, they're maturing, and it could be an environment in which the future of our society can be amazing and incredible. But at the same time, I look at really just this clamp down on it doesn't matter what's right. It's I'm right and you're wrong. And that really, and I would say it's been faced in history for, how many hundreds of years, and it hasn't led to anything great. It's only when, those difficult things to talk about, right? And they can only be talked about in the environment where people are okay with being wrong and want to discover what's right, is really where progress is made.
Yeah, there's this great book by Jonathan Rauch called Kindly Inquisitors that he wrote. And actually the audiobook now is, Penn Jillette is a big fan of it. And he did the audiobook for the 20th anniversary of Kindly Inquisitors a little while back. And it's all about, something that all First Amendment people have to explain is kind of like most of human history is what Rauch calls fundamentalist. And he doesn't mean that in a religious sense. He means that authority and truth come from the top down, whether it's, your chief or your oligarchs or your theocratic, pharaoh, that essentially that's the way figuring out truth works. And that's most of human history. And it's really a radical idea to start being like, you know what, I am going to stop burning heretics. I am going to stop making loudmouths drink hemlock. I'm going to stop crucifying the people who say, ideas that really bother me, like all of these things that we have done to either dissenters or weirdos, burning them at the stake, beheading them, all of this kind of thing will weighted the dissenter in ages past. And not only will I tolerate that person, I'm even going to listen to them sometimes.
I'm going to listen to them.
It's crazy. And it's a very hard social order to maintain. It doesn't come naturally to us. But with time, you start seeing this approach has real advantages. But it does undermine kind of like that comfortable certainty that essentially, I've talked about this in terms of Dostoevsky, that I feel like one of the messages throughout Dostoevsky's book is great human evil comes out of the desire to explain the meaning of life in 10 words or less. that essentially having that ideology, having that theory that you can always come back to that frees you of the duty to think is very, very tempting, but there's great evil there. But, freedom of speech, hearing people you disagree with, none of this comes very naturally. And unfortunately, I feel like some institutions on campus are actually pushing us more towards our more negative instincts on this, that listen to the people you already agree with. And in the book, we have, of course, people know about the Milo riots at Berkeley. I understand people not liking Milo Yiannopoulos. I'm not the biggest fan myself, but it was an absolutely out of control riot in which there were people who were very badly hurt, that if you watch the videos of them being assaulted, you were like, I can't believe those people survived, being hit across the head with a 20-foot flagpole. It was really terrifying. We also talk about the Evergreen State University case involving Brett Weinstein. We got Pamela Paretsky, who is our chief researcher on this, went out and did some of the interviews on that. And it's really, once again, much worse than I thought. And even really sad incidents where a very respected young philosophy professor wrote a piece talking about the ideas of Rachel Dolezal, was the woman who convinced everybody that she was actually Black when she was actually a white woman, and she became like president of her local NAACP and worked for a university. And a professor wrote about this, saying, okay, so if we think that gender is actually more fluid, and you can, it's up to you to kind of decide what your gender identity is. Why don't we apply this to racial identity? Done in a very academic way, done in a very thoughtful way. And we liken it to something that, and we don't try to do this lightly, but we liken it to a witch hunt, that essentially it was a relatively small transgression, and suddenly she's, they're demanding that the magazine withdraw the article, which is unusual. They're, recommending that this person be fired. This is Rebecca Tuvel. And what's even more messed up about it was that some of the professors who had signed, these circulated petitions saying, down with Professor Tuvel, would contact her independently and say, listen, I'm really sorry what's happening to you. And it's like that. And that's kind of the dynamic of like when a mob's lost its mind, when essentially like, I couldn't really disagree with the mob. It's like,
well, it's the mob and individual, right? It's like it's that whole, like, here's the individual apologizing for, the sins of the mob.
Yep.
That's amazing. Well, I
Lots
had
of crazy stories in the book.
well, you could write like volumes of books on all of this, because, as much as it applies to education, right, it applies to, politics, the economy, business. I mean, one thing I've been thinking as you've been talking and making these points is like, what, the purpose of college, right, is X, right? People go in with expectations of, okay, these are the results I want to get by finishing college, which is getting a job, having a profession, figuring out what I want to do. Like, but that's the thing. It's like in the corporate world with me, we've gotten to the point where we don't look at necessarily colleges as a good thing. Sometimes we'll look at where they went to college, okay, and then their personality and how they fit within culture. Because if you have mob mentality, mob theory, right, it's not good for a company, right? And it could be in a sense if values align. But most companies want creativity. They want strengths. They look at being able to combine multiple people with different perspectives and different backgrounds in order to accomplish a common end. And if you've been, reared with this kind of mob rule, it's difficult to fit into a company, and it's going to actually hurt going to certain colleges in a sense if you really think about it.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Unfortunately, we've come to a very similar conclusion. And I will say this, I want to be very clear about this. I went to American University as a scholarship student. And it was, it was a school that I always feel some hostility towards it because they kept on chipping away at my scholarships, even though I had very good grades, and I'll never forgive them for that. But it definitely was a place that was less dogmatic than Stanford, where I went to law school. Now, I always want to be clear. I received a world-class education there. Like, it was great. They were smart and interesting people. But now I do wonder that, particularly for some of these elite colleges, I've said this flat out in some cases. You might want to, we've had great luck hiring people from University of Indiana, from a lot of the big, high-quality state schools. And I think that some of this dysfunctional ideology is less present there. And I've heard, and a lot of these people don't want to come forward, but I've heard, I've talked to people who work for cause organizations, like big, like legal representation organizations that do a good job of like helping homeless people and working on the sides of the angels and all sorts of stuff. And they'll say candidly that they've been paralyzed by some of the expectations from the younger employees from some of the elite schools, because they've gotten so used to this very inward-looking way of arguing, that more or less just kind of assumes all of your allies are trying to oppress you. That's not functional. Like that's going to, if you end up having schools that are producing, employees who are not able to look beyond their own sort of personal drama to actually deliver to the greater good of what the company's trying to do,
Yep.
It's poison. And of course, I know from personal experience, when you're trying to run a really professional shop, one really disruptive person
Ruins the whole thing.
and particularly if you don't trust that person, and that's something that I've said to my employees a million times. I'm like, listen, we try to be very good to our employees. We try to find good people and keep them. But if I can't trust you, you'll be fired in a heartbeat. And it scares people at first. I'm like, yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about like, don't lie to me. Like, don't try to pull a fast one, because if I see that in your character, that's not someone I ever want to work with again. I've basically given two pieces of advice, I think, for people running businesses. Be careful hiring younger people from some of these really elite colleges. And also, my stock tip is, if you can invest in human resources organizations, do. They're going to have a lot of work in the next, 5 to 10 years.
Well, you have a lot of like, there's a segment, whether it's, Simon Sinek is a big one, where you have a segment of, the personal development space that's focusing on all of this. And that's where I've learned a ton, because yeah, it's like trying to work with somebody who doesn't want to be wrong, that can't be wrong, that's like afraid of being wrong. It's the worst thing in the world. And it's like, there's no progress that's made, because justifications are in every, in everything that doesn't necessarily go as planned. So it's one of those, like, it's kind of to finish this up. I knew this was going to be a long interview, right? But it's one of those things where, I have kids and I understand the nature of coddling. I have a
Sure.
4-year-old, and it's kind of like, I think about it all the time. I'm like,
oh
man,
my God,
I love this
me too.
kid.
I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I always say this. I'm like, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying not coddling your kids is easy. It's hard.
It's super hard. Yeah.
And because that's all you want to do. Like basically, I just want to hug my sons and make sure that nobody ever like makes them cry.
And you feel like, if you think about some harm coming to them, it's like you want to break down walls.
Yeah, exactly. Or just, weep. So I totally get it. So there was a great book by Sarah Zasky called Achtung Baby, which is about how the Germans are actually doing a better job raising their kids in a free, independent environment than we are. So like everything's like really switched in this respect. That essentially, the home of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn is now has helicopter parenting, whereas Germany, like the classic authoritarian culture, at least in our imaginations, is actually has a really strong societal commitment to raising independent, self-sufficient kids, self-reliant kids. And one thing that really I thought was so important about that book, though, is it's very easy to dismiss some of these like cultural norms as just being a peculiarity of that culture. And that's why it's so great that Sarah Zasky, the author of it, put in an interview with one of the German parents where they were like, no, don't misunderstand. This is very hard for us. Like I want to run up and hug my kids and make sure that they don't, go off to the overnight slumber camp too early, but they know it's good for them, and they know and you have to value it as a society, because you can really do such great harm if you don't teach children to think for themselves, to be independent, to be at least to some degree self-reliant, and it harms them right down to their locus of control. And locus of control is a psychological idea. And it's very common sense that essentially, like, if you feel like you have no control over your own life, it's a great formula for making people depressed and anxious. And when you have all of these, and this is the one reason why I don't particularly love the title coddling, is because it sometimes gives you the idea of this kind of like spoiled, pampered kid. And when I think about a lot of these kids who are actually going to the elite colleges, they work very, very hard, and they've been working very, very hard since they're very young. They've been scheduled from 6 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night for a lot of their childhoods. So I think of them more like a very finely designed rocket, that only knows how to do one thing.
Mhm.
But then they show up on campus. We did a lot of interviews with Julie Lythcott-Haims, who wrote this great book called How to Raise an Adult, which came out of her dealing with students who were incoming to Stanford, freshmen incoming, and this really sad scenes of like this brilliant, kid who's constantly on the phone to their parents to ask them what to do, and they don't know how to do their laundry, they don't know how to cook for themselves, and all of these little things that they're what make you actually feel like you can live your life on your own and be successful. They're really essential. They're not little things.
No, they're not. It creates a sense of confidence, a sense of certainty that, wow, I mean, there's the idea of dependence and independence. I mean, like, we can talk about that for eons, because that dates back to the beginning of time too.
Sure.
Right. And there's certain principles associated with it, but they absolutely apply to rearing kids. And that comes down to, what's the result that you're looking for? And I can see how wanting to coddle, okay, that desire, it's the same desire as, understanding, getting a child from, this idea of dependence into independence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Same desire. You want what's best for your child, but really it comes down to the same thing we've been talking about, which is, it's like they're going to be independent at some point, and there's ways in which you can, create the environment, right, so that they can experience some adversity, they can experience tension and pressure, right, and learn from it. You can't teach that. It's like that has to be. There's certain things that just have to be experienced in order to learn. There's no app for it. You can't can't go onto YouTube and experience it. Like it's
Right.
actually like you have to experience.
Can I simulate experience that? And the answer is no.
Maybe VR. Once they figure VR out, maybe you can experience it that way. But my point is, it's like, there's nothing that can replace that, which is figuring things out and understanding other perspectives and failing. Right. I think this goes to Peter Gray. We were talking about him before, the free to learn, where failure is a concoction of, in a sense, the school system. Right. Because you look at failure and it's like not doing something right is just, okay, well, I'm going to do it better next time. It's part of the process. Whereas failure, it's like, we're done. I'm dumb and I can't learn anything. And, and so I don't know, I look at, the experience I've had in life and in business and with kids. And, I think there's principles that are old as time, and you reference a lot of them in the book, and they date back to Aristotle, they date back to Socrates. And, there's these ideas that have existed and they apply just as much today as they did then. And I look at I don't know, sometimes these type of events where schools fail. I mean, they're failing because they're loading kids with debt. I mean, they should be more pissed at that. Like, instead of being pissed off of it opposing points of views, they should be pissed at all the money they're getting charged that they're gonna have to pay back one day.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's the idea that, it's not sustainable. There's something that's just going to grow and get worse and blow up. And sometimes those are the events, right, that get people to step back and be like, all right, I guess that didn't work. So let's now learn from it and move on.
I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can, fix higher education, because there's parts of it that I really, truly love. And practically every book I read, or at least a big chunk of them, are written by, university professors who are talking about what they've been working on their whole lives. And so I'm very aware of the special role and a very positive role that higher education has. But I also spend a lot of time thinking about, surely we can figure out less expensive, higher yield, better ways to, and also, my being an employer, a fire, we have about 50 people working for us at this point, has really colored my view of all of this stuff. And, trying to figure out like what you actually want in an employee. But also, I'm a civics guy. So I'm also like, what do we also want in citizens? And I think if you really broke it down, calculus is fun. It's an interesting intellectual puzzle, but I'd take someone who has a solid grounding in statistics or has some amount of numeracy. They actually know roughly, what population sizes look like and that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff you want people to know. And we're not doing a very good job of delivering any of this. So one of the reasons why there is this disproportionate favoritism for the elite colleges is because the elite colleges get to be in the position of finding kids who are already bright and hardworking, and then all they have to do is not ruin them by 4 years. And I think, some would argue that they probably do their best job at it, or they really can improve their thinking. A lot of times when they go in for a hard science degree. But surely there's got to be a better way, and I think that it's not as if we're going to get rid of higher education, nor would I even want to, but I think a lot of the worst excesses from everything from cost to dysfunctionality would be addressed if people could finally start figuring out some of the, breaking the riddle of like what would be a good competitive model for this. As soon as it's kind of like, I think we all remember when Apple finally became a real threat to IBM's dominance, that suddenly magically, all of our computers just got a lot better, and I think that if there was something that was enough to make the academy anxious, we would see a lot of these problems get fixed quickly.
Well, I think, yeah, big, and we should probably end with this because I want to give you just a second to talk about fire and how people can get involved.
Sure, absolutely.
But I look at, that's a great example, and that's what competition often breeds, right? Where, and I think that there are signs of that, right? You have a lot of online, like ASU now, which is known as like a reputable school, very reputable school system, mm-hmm. has online, online this, online that, and so I think there's things that are going to be disrupting, but I really think the tidal wave of kids not being able to pay back their student loans, I think that right there is going to be one of those catalysts to. There's so much pressure and so much negativity that pushes the up and coming generations to realize that, wow, I'm not paying $150,000 for school, right? I'm going to go this route, and so hopefully that manifests soon, because it's still, I don't know, it's still kind of getting more out of control.
No, agreed. So FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, where you can find out more about us at thefire.org. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. We're doing a big event in New York City. We defend free speech on college campuses all across the political spectrum. If you get in trouble on a college campus, we defend you. One thing that I think is very unique about FIRE, and I do believe that things can be very unique, no matter what grammar people say, is that we actually have people who vote for different people all across the spectrum. We actually practice what we preach, and we have an office in which people, Republicans and Democrats and Green Party and Christians and Jewish people and Muslim people and atheists like me, all work together for common cause. And we just came out with our 10 worst schools for free speech list just yesterday.
I saw that, yeah.
And it's always, it always kind of like surprises people what ends up getting on there, because yes, absolutely, some of the cases are political correctness run amok. People now understand that that's relatively common. But there's also cases where it's just like at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's really just kind of like, could you please stop criticizing the administration? We don't like this very much. Sort of story as old as time. If you have kids, by the way, that are going to college, whether you or any of your listeners, we provide guides to due process and fair procedure that every student should read before they go on. It's what to do if you find yourself in front of one of these disciplinary tribunals. We also have a guide to freedom of speech that you can use. And if worse comes to worse and you actually get in trouble on campus, we're very successful in getting students and professors who get in trouble out of trouble.
Well, we'll make sure, that we'll make sure all the links. I mean, I know you have obviously FIRE's website, and then you have a really cool URL, the coddling.com,
Uh-huh.
for the book. But we'll make sure all those links get out on our social media and as
Great.
well as our blog, so we can increase awareness of what you guys are doing to impact the what seems to be ominous at this point.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and I gotta get back to defending
Yeah,
truth.
so I'm 20 minutes late for something else. So
Oh,
Greg, you're awesome. It was an awesome conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
really fun chatting with you. Take care.
Yeah.
Hey, listeners, thanks for tuning in. My book, the Amazon bestseller, Heads I Win, Tails You Lose, a financial strategy to reignite the American dream, is completely changing the way people look at saving, wealth, and retirement. Want a sneak peek? Head on over to www.headsortailsiwin.com/podcast for a free audio and text download of my favorite chapter. Again, that's headsortailsiwin.com/podcast.